The United Nations is expressing serious concern over the deaths of at least 31 people in Kenya where police and protesters clashed during anti-government demonstrations the previous day. The violence erupting on Sabasaba Day, which means 7/7, when demonstrators annually mark the events of July the 7th, 1990, when Kenyans rose up to demand a return to multi-party democracy after years of autocratic rule by the then President Daniel Arap Moi. Protests are ongoing against the present-day government of the ruling man, William Ruto.
Life has almost returned to normal in Nairobi this Tuesday, a day after violent clashes between protesters and police officers. Shops opened as usual and locals are back to work after an obligatory day off.
I didn't work yesterday, so I didn't earn any money at all. I hope in any case that the government, whether they like it or not, has heard the people's demands.
Authorities closed the capital's main roads on Monday to dissuade protesters from reaching the centre of town. Every year, thousands celebrate Sabasaba Day, remembering the nationwide protests on the 7th of July 1990, when Kenyans had filled the streets demanding free elections. Since last year, the commemoration has been linked to a wave of protest against President William Ruto, accused of corruption and police brutality. Not without reason, on the 25th of June this year, several protesters were killed in clashes with the police.
Last time the police came with violence. They should come in peace. Looking at these trucks, it's clear they want violence.
The situation was extremely tense yesterday and the protests rapidly descended into violence. As protesters threw stones at the police, authorities responded with firing tear gas grenades. Violence on both sides, which was condemned by the United Nations.
We are deeply troubled by the killings yesterday of at least 10 people, as well as looting and destruction of property in Kenya as police and other security forces responded to violent protests in the capital of Nairobi. Lethal ammunition, rubber bullets, tear gas, and water cannons were used.
Hundreds of protesters were also arrested. The divorce between President Ruto and Kenyan youth has rarely been more apparent.
And of course, since the UN's Rowena Shamdasani was interviewed there, the toll has gone up from 10 to 31. Let's bring in Irũngũ Houghton, who is from Amnesty Kenya, joining us from Nairobi. Irũngũ, thanks for being with us. The UN deeply concerned, deeply troubled by what's happening in Kenya. What is Amnesty Kenya's take on this situation?
Amnesty International would share the concerns of the United Nations. The figures of 31 dead, probably about 20 out of the 47 counties were paralyzed yesterday by, running battles and violence by the police and also criminals. I mean, we've verified, just over 150 injuries as well with the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. And what's really ironic about this is that they had been called to commemorate another day 35 years ago when 20 people had died, so 10 less than we saw yesterday, and a similar number had been charged in a court of law. And it just seems that we've not been able to facilitate protests in Kenya over the last 35 years. They just seem to turn very violent and very dangerous.
At an earlier point in what has been a sequence of protests ongoing, the president tried to clamp down on any media coverage of what was going on. That raised alarm in many countries of a kind of a hush-up of what was happening and then what might be happening when the cameras are switched off. I'm wondering whether President Ruto is under a great deal of pressure right now, given what is happening on the streets and given the accusations being made against his administration.
Yes, I mean, although much of the focus has been on violent policing or police brutality, the obvious driver is not necessarily policing, it's actually politics and the sense that the government has lost, popular support within the country. And therefore, what is essentially unfolding is really a kind of rebellion against his government. Yesterday, we saw, Nairobi basically shut down and something like about 14 million, I think it's about $140 million worth of business was essentially just interrupted as we saw the city shut down. For many of us, the concern has been that we don't seem to see any new strategies to be able to reach out and reach agreement with the protesters. What they're asking for essentially is that the officers that have killed Kenyans, I think about 120 20 Kenyans Kenyan protesters over the last 2 years, that those officers need to be brought to book. The officers and their commanders that have been enforcibly disappearing or abducting, critics of the government, they need to be brought to book, and the multi-agency team needs to be disbanded. These are the kind of demands that we saw over this week. I think the other thing that we do have to see is the police begin to find new ways of facilitating protests. They failed at least 3 important tests yesterday. The first was the test of facilitating protests, protecting the protests, and essentially the roadblocks that they placed around different capital or different cities forced the violence into residential neighborhoods. And we have at least 2 minors who have been killed. One of them is Bridget Njoki, who was 12 years old. She was shot through her through a wall in her house as she was watching television, and she was one of the many children who couldn't go to school that day. So we are seeing a heavy toll in terms of violence.
This is absolutely horrific what you're just describing, Irũngũ, and Irũngũ, I can't begin to imagine how that family must be feeling right now. Many people angry about corruption. We're hearing people complaining about lack of opportunity for young people, but it sounds like there's something more endemic happening there within Kenyan society. Can you put your finger on that?
Well, I think, the first point that you've raised, which is the economic distress, that a lot of young people just don't see any future in Kenya anymore. They are concerned about the cost of living. They are concerned about the lack of jobs. They increasingly feel that the government is not interested in generating employment or opportunities for them. And therefore, when they see these large, ostentatious, expenditure patterns, they are very concerned about their future. And I think that's the underlying concern that many young people have at the moment. I think the violence that we're seeing on the streets and in terms of the enforced disappearances, that is just compounding the situation, so that every time a person is shot, like, for example, a vendor, Karaoke, who was simply trying to sell COVID-style masks to protesters and even police officers, he was shot at close range, and about a week later died of his injuries. And much of Kenya has seen that footage. Every time we see one of those cases, or we hear about children like Bridget Njoki, the country gets even more radicalized, and the possibility of a consensus or a political breakthrough gets slimmer and slimmer. We're 2 years away from the election, so it's actually going to be quite a long period before Kenyans have the opportunity to select their leader, as they did in 2022.
Irũngũ Houghton, Executive Director of Amnesty Kenya, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis, your reflections and your eyewitness statements with us on the situation in your country in Kenya. Irũngũ Houghton there from Amnesty International. Thanks again.